In early August, President Trump enacted unprecedented measures to bring the National Guard to Washington, D.C. and take over local police forces in order to deal with alleged crime and homelessness issues. And this has brought up all sorts of legal, practical, and policy issues, with many residents furious about this presence and others having more mixed feelings, given the belief that maybe the approach isn't perfect, but there are major crime issues going unaddressed in the city. All of this uncertainty is fertile ground for bad statistics, as the public discourse has centered around the trajectory of crime in the city, the possibility of crime statistics being reported incorrectly or misreported, and whether the numbers are perfectly matching the lived experiences of residents. Is violent crime at a 30-year low? Are homicides more than double what they were a decade ago? How can we tell if something is wrong with the data, if the data itself is potentially unreliable? We'll talk about all this and more on today's episode as we dig into DC crime data and crime data in general. Hello, and welcome to Of Significance, the podcast where if loving data analytics is a crime, you can go ahead and lock us up. I'm your everyman host, Brent right here, with two experts who have got a nose for numbers. One doesn't need a warrant to investigate data. It's Dr. Nathan Woods, and you're not convincing him to be reasonable beyond a doubt. It's Dr. Steve Bronars. Steve, Nathan, how are you?
Doing very well.
Great to be here, Brent. Thank you.
So I just want to add in a quick caveat before we get into this. So just as in statistics, there are technical designations that are super important. In crime, there are also definitions and terms that are really important and might be a little bit different from our colloquial usage. So for example, when people talk about assault, often they mean physically harming another person, but in a criminal circumstance, that's generally battery. Assault is when a person intentionally causes fear of physical harm or offensive contact to another person. So there's going to be a little bit of looseness in the way that we use these terms. We are obviously not criminologists and we're not lawyers. That's our classic disclaimer. But we will try and soldier through. So the way I want to kind of
we're
talk
not
about
soldiers either.
We're not soldiers either. So I want to talk before Trump brought in the federal officers to deal with crime, there were allegations that DC had issues with reporting crime stats. And the specific allegation that was leveled was that higher level officers would order lower level officers to reclassify crimes like assault with a deadly weapon into something called like felony assault, which has a similar sentence but is not reported in crime stats the same way. There are a number of other crimes that maybe have this kind of misclassification issue. We're not going to deal with the nature of that potentially fraudulent reporting. I believe there's investigations that are going on. I think the first thing I want to get into with y'all is if we have an issue where there's some reclassification issue, how might we check to see whether or not the numbers that we're getting are reliable in the first place?
Well, I think that I am not sure how much of this is going on. I understand these allegations, but I think oftentimes some of the crime figures are reported at more aggregated levels. Property crimes, violent crimes, other types of crimes. And while, there's a difference between a homicide and something that was an aggravated assault or battery, like you were talking about, that they're probably not going to be reclassifying between those more aggregate categories. Plus, with the small numbers for some of these crime categories, I'd have more faith in the more aggregated categories. The more you disaggregate and you're looking at shorter time periods, I think the more likely it could be, for whatever reason, that there's some possible noise in the data. And even though something went up or down, that might not be indicative of a longer term trend.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that if there is a change, whether it's going up or down, I think it's important to go back to, what do we think is behind that? And if there was, we're going to talk a little bit about a policy intervention in terms of this police presence in DC, but just in general, you would like to say, hey, we instituted this program. We put more cops out on the street, or we are spending the money differently within the police department on a different initiative. And that is we expect that to be tied to a particular decrease in certain kinds of crimes. And then you go back and you find those decreases and that it's consistent with what your theoretical expectation was given that different policy. If it's just going down and there's no difference, and by the way, when I say policy, it could be, the economy could be booming and youth unemployment could be at the lower rates or something else. But you want to tie it to something so that you are not surprised to see crime go down for no reason whatsoever.
Yeah, and I think being able to look at other cities or finding other comparable regions and looking at what happens with their crime statistics over that same period might give you more assurance that the trajectory is believable. If you saw something very different, maybe you'd have to investigate, are there other factors? Like, was there some policy in one city versus another? Was there some economic boom in one city versus another? But looking to outside sources, I think, is a great way to add that level of verification. There's this other claim that's made, which is that when it comes to juvenile crime statistics versus adult crime statistics, they're reported differently. So, for example, in DC, there is juvenile crime reporting, but it happens on a biennial basis. So there's every 6 months we get a new set of statistics on juvenile crime, and that is reported separately from the regularly updating adult crime. So when news organizations are kind of focusing on the latest numbers, they might not be seeing the full picture of crime in the city. Do you guys have any suggestions for kind of handling that from a data perspective, or is it all just the media needs to be more aware about what they're actually reporting?
I mean, I think that the prime age for committing crimes includes teenagers. So I don't know, may depend on the jurisdiction, the difference between youth and adult, but it sounds less serious if you say, well, these were young people committing these crimes. But if they're pretty serious crimes, I would question something that says, well, we're not going to count that serious crime in the same way. But I think in a lot of these, you don't know who, when the incidents are being reported, it's not clear who the perpetrator was. So I'm not sure how much of an effect it has, but to the extent it has an effect, I think that if we're talking about serious crimes, whether the perpetrator was 16 or 17 or 19 or 20, I think it shouldn't make that much of a difference if we're trying to get the best data on the incidence of these kinds of offenses.
So kind of getting into the policy going into effect, there has been some early reporting on changes in crime rates over the period that the federal officers have been here. For example, reported violent crime is down 10% from the previous 3-week period, while property crime incidents have fallen by 25%. Where do you guys sit on interpreting numbers that are so fresh? Do you think that those are going to be reliable? The fact, I think that a lot of people would have the intuition, to your point, Nathan, that there is going to be some effect by having just more of a police presence might lead us to believe that that is a reliable prediction, that we would expect to see the crime down. But how do you think those numbers shake out in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, so they are fresh. And so you'd always want to, I think, take, the newness with a grain of salt. It's also a very short period of time. So whether or not there's some kind of lasting change, I think that would be a very different question. I think most of the studies that you're seeing are simply saying, yeah, there's, this month compared to this month last year, or maybe last month, you see these reductions in crime. And I think, yeah, are those numbers exactly right? Are they going to hold up over time? Maybe not, but my intuition says, of course, if you add a whole bunch of police to a city, it's a fairly small city, you're going to have less crime, at least in the short run. I think that begs the question about kind of at what cost. There are lots of ways of thinking about that, whether the cost of the additional boots on the ground or the cost in terms of, a lot of those same reports are talking about, fewer tourists and less people going out to eat, and the bike share rates are much lower. So unless And it's possible that the people that are renting the bikes and going out to eat were the ones that were doing all the crime. And that's the causal factor here. But I don't think so. But yeah, I think it's too short a period of time, but it doesn't shock me that the rates of crimes have gone down.
Well, so if you look at the various crimes that are reported, there's some that are reported on a daily basis and then many others which don't have that same frequency. So one of the crimes, there's huge variation across crime type to how much of an effect is shown. So for homicides, there were 3 homicides in the first 3 weeks of the takeover compared to 8 in the prior 3 weeks, which is like a decline of 60%. The thing that's funny to me is that it's such a small number. How would you be reasonably confident that that isn't a fluke, or that if I compared to the same 3-week period from the prior year, that I wouldn't also see that same drop that's occurring because of the seasonality of crime?
Yeah, I think that whether it's a 3-week period or a 3-month period, 2 things you would do. One, go back, because there is a seasonality, go back to last year at the same time, previous years at the same time. What do we typically see? And even in that, it could depend on weather. It could depend on other things that vary. And then number 2, like Nathan said earlier, what's happening in Baltimore, what's happening in other cities, because there's other changes that are going on that are just are not being modeled in the simple before and after. But I think that in the number of homicides in any location except for a handful of cities is going to be a pretty low probability event. So it has some real, it is clearly one of the worst possible crimes, but it has this kind of small numbers problem. And so I think for that, you need to have a little bit more than just a few weeks of data to have some kind of confidence, not to in any way diminish, those 5 lives that might have been saved, or, whatever would be the cause of that going from 8 to 3. But I do think if it's a more rare event like homicides, you need to follow things for a longer period to have the same kind of confidence.
Well, there's something interesting to me that there is this, allegation about classifying crimes as being less severe. And one of the main categories that people often point to is the assault with a dangerous weapon or assault with a deadly weapon charge. That only saw a 3% drop over the 3-week period. And if that held for a longer period of time, however long the federal officers are here, you might then have another check to show they might have been reporting it consistently over the period, and that there isn't some push that's been made to try and reclassify that crime. It feels weird that if you're alleging that there is a drop, or that their officers are reclassifying a crime, and I add more officers and I don't see the crime drop dramatically, or I don't see any effect on that crime, I would wonder about the allegation in the first place.
Well, I wonder about the allegation in the first place, no matter what. I don't know. Clearly there may be some benefit you get from fudging the numbers there, but I would think that most of the people involved in this are out there and they're assessing what happened at the crime scene. The 3% drop is relative to what? Maybe last year at this time, because that is a crime that tends to occur more in August than other months. It might have gone up 5%. So the 3% decline relative to the typical increase of 5%. So I think there's still not enough information. I don't even know what I would have a tremendous confidence in based on 3 weeks of data. I wouldn't necessarily expect all of the crime categories, if we're right that having a greater police presence reduces the incidence of crime, they wouldn't all necessarily move parallel down in the same percentage terms. So I think it's just like everybody said, view this with a grain of salt. It's better than going up 3%, that's for sure, if it's an accurate number.
And I am not 100% familiar with those allegations of the fudging, but I think it's maybe one person has currently been put on leave, and I don't know how, what that person's scope of authority would be. So even if you accepted the premise that something fishy was going on, I wonder how much it could impact the citywide statistics anyway. And this is one of those times, and we do a fair amount of this in our work, right? I mean, there's the data, there's the statistics, and then there's, well, based on what we're seeing there, maybe you need to go back and actually talk to some people and look at some documents and figure out what really happened in a way that the data may not reflect. And I'm sure that's probably what's going on with this. And you could probably get to the answer more quickly by interviewing that person and the people that were reporting to that person than looking at the crime statistics going up and down over the 3-week period, month to month, or in the month of the same month last year, that sort of thing.
I think that a lot of things are going to be plea bargained down, and so there's going to be a difference between at the different stages of what the initial classification of this was, and then what the person pleads to, because the court system is really clogged up, and most of these things are adjudicated by plea bargains, and in order to get the person to accept the plea, it's going to be for a lesser charge, if not just probation and other things. So I could see that there is some benefit, maybe optically, for the police forces. Hey, there's less serious crimes being reported. But at the end of the day, there's so many other aspects of what's going on with the crime data that I just am skeptical that would ever play that much of a role. Which is not to say that it didn't play any role at all, but I think there's so many other things going on that at the same time it'd be hard to say how important that was.
So I feel a little bit like the economist searching for his keys where the light is by going back to these numbers, because we feel like they're a little bit suspicious. But some of the other crimes that had reported changes, the most dramatic changes were coming from incidents of burglary and theft of automobiles dropping 40%, and motor vehicle theft generally was down 35%. I think the thing that's interesting to me is understanding which crimes are seeing how much of a drop and which crimes are ones that you could push to other areas, because DC is somewhat uniquely located between two states and has two major cities right next to it. It's not as hard to displace crime from DC into either of those states. I'm curious what you guys think about, after the federal officers leave, how we might anticipate our numbers changing, if we can expect any lasting effect from those drops, or if we think that there's going to be some signal about the kinds of crimes that are being committed dropping, that those could very easily return.
Okay, I have a couple thoughts on this. One is that just the presence of something like the National Guard in certain areas, it frees up police to be allocated to other areas, and there are certain types of crimes that may be deterred just by having the presence of an authority figure there. So I wouldn't, those crimes you might say, well, that's going to go down, whether that's, grabbing someone's purse or backpack. I don't know if stealing a car would fall into that category. So again, I don't know why we would think all of the crimes for this particular policy intervention would go down the same. I think to understand what would happen after this policy goes back to what it was before, there would need to be some theory as to what would lead to a permanent change. What would cause that impact to last? It's not obvious to me what that would be, but I'm not a criminologist. I'm not an expert in understanding, how different policing practices would influence things. But it would seem to me that the more we saw a decline that lasted, even though the policy was no longer in place, the more I think there might have been some other factor that was causing it, not the policy itself. But again, that would require a better explanation of what was achieved for this relatively short period when this policy was applied. And so I'm not ruling that out as a possibility, but that's kind of my initial reaction would be. I'd kind of expect it to revert, mean reversion a bit back to what it was before, unless they really address some of the underlying fundamental issues there.
Yeah, so we do lots of statistics here. Presumably we've got methods for testing in a pre and post period, whether or not there was an effect of the policy. How reliable do you think such a test might be given the quality of the data? How would you approach that, or what concerns might you have, looking at the before and after?
I think so. There's lots of ways to look at policy interventions like this. And it's kind of a pre-post. And in this case, because unlike a lot of policies, I think it's going to end and we have an idea that it will end. So you'll also have a post the post. But I think the challenge is the one we've talked about, is that the period of time under study is pretty limited. And it's a pretty nuanced set of information. I mean, the points that Steve kind of raised about there's going to be some variability in crime rates, even particular kinds of crime that are explained through other things. So it would have to be a pretty sophisticated model, not just on the crime rate itself, before the thing, during the thing, and after the thing, but controlling for a bunch of other factors, seasonality being one of them. The availability of jobs for young people in DC. If that goes, up, that would change your expectation about how much crime might be happening as a result. So you'd have to take all of that into account.
I think let me ask you this question, that the next city, your city, in some ways, Brent, Memphis, isn't that next on the list? And if this policy is repeated elsewhere, you might think, well, we could combine the data from DC with Memphis, but those are very different places. They're going to happen at different times a year. Maybe, at the time this was instituted in DC, there are a lot of visitors. I'm not sure when do people go visit Memphis?
I don't think they do.
They don't. Right.
So, but it's the school year when they show up.
People go to Memphis during the summer a lot. It's a big summer place. There's lots of music festivals and all kinds of great food.
But anyway, even if it's the same policy repeated in a different city, I'm not sure you can pool across those and say, well, if auto theft went down 30% in DC, is that what we expect to happen in Memphis? I think that there's so many of these other factors that are going on that are probably not going to be controlled for in simple studies. I wouldn't predict that it would have the same effect in the next city and the city after that if it is tried in other jurisdictions. It's just there's so many other differences, and so I think you just have to, like we've been saying, it's important to look at the data but recognize the limitations of this kind of short policy intervention, and then kind of the variation of the data that that's just going to happen even absent a policy intervention.
Yeah, and there's a problem, if you were to implement the program, a few months or a year from now, as Nathan pointed out, there can be economic factors that might affect one area versus another. And that combined with the presence of federal officers could have a different effect than just the federal officers entering the area. So the fact that there is a time difference is going to make for all kinds of issues.
Right. And I would, there was some spatial representation of where the let's just stick with the auto theft. Where did that occur? Did it go down? I doubt if it went down 30% across the entire district. It probably went down more in some areas than others. And so it could lead to further study of what worked and what didn't. So yes, we're saying it's a temporary intervention, but I think things could be learned from this. I just wouldn't be that confident in one policy intervention that lasted a month or two. But the more data that's gathered, the more you might be able to figure out what works and what doesn't.
So as we think about crime in the post period, we have an issue broadly with any crime stat that there's going to be underreporting of data for a variety of reasons. People don't want to be involved with the police. There might be a doubt in whether or not police can actually do anything about a crime. There's some crimes that feel embarrassing, or you might be ashamed. There's an issue where we suspect there are more crimes that are happening than are reported, but we don't know how many. I'm curious how this enters the equation, and we think about what crime looks like in DC or in any city that's trying to implement a policy to improve their crime rates.
Right. So I'm glad you brought that up. There's a national victimization survey that the Bureau of Justice has been doing for 50 years. And it's a national survey, so we can't really zoom into DC. But what we do know is that only about 42% of violent crimes are reported, 42%, with less than a third of violent crimes in cities being reported, and only like 32% of property crimes, with only about 1 in 4 property crimes being reported. And like you said, there could be lots of reasons. It could be that you're engaged in an illegal activity and your money gets stolen, and you don't want to call the police to say like, "Hey,
he stole my drug money."
Right. So that's on one end, and the other end it could be like your bicycle is stolen when other things have been stolen. It never gets recovered. The police have more important things. You just get tired of, notifying the police when it's not going to really make a difference to you. What's your incentive to do that? But it is interesting that in rural areas, people tend to report crimes at a significantly higher rate than in urban areas. And, so I think that there's some valuable information in here. But when I looked at the data in the most recent wave of this, they reported by state for the most populous states. So not every state, because it's a national survey and they don't have enough observations. And what do you think the two most, now murder is not part of this. I dug into the data a little bit. So this is very interesting. I tend to believe the victim responses, they're telling the truth. And so then, like, what do you think the two highest crime rate states are according to the victimization survey? And here's a hint. Once I learned these were the two highest states, I really started questioning the survey in terms of, is everybody responding in the same way? Is everybody willing in a survey to even say that they were a victim of particular crimes?
I'm going to guess the freak states, Hawaii and Alaska.
Nathan, you have any?
Texas, Florida.
That's what I would have expected. States like that, big cities, whatever. Colorado and Washington.
Oh, interesting.
So I have my own theory as to what's going on in those states and what they consider, but it's just like clearly a possibility of some people, even in an interview setting, may be reluctant to say something happened to them. And so I'm not sure where we could turn to really the best data for this. But if we believe that even in the aggregate across the U.S., it's roughly right. There's like for every 3 property crimes, only 1 makes its way to law enforcement. Because the question is, did you report this to law enforcement? And, less than half of the violent crimes, again, other than homicide, are reported to law enforcement. So the change in reporting rate, as people have more or less faith in the system, could really be driving some of these moves from one year to the next. And the rates that are coming back through the uniform crime reports that are coming through police departments and other law enforcement. And so I think that just adds a whole extra layer to like, well, okay, when we see something go up or down, what can we conclude about that?
I've got a crime reporting anecdote. I live next to an alley, and there are people who dump in the alley all the time, and it's illegal to dump. And obviously, dumping is not
even in DC.
Yeah, yes, even in DC, it's illegal, despite what you might see around the city. It's not obviously the most important of crimes, but it's super annoying to have people who just come, leave a bunch of loose garbage, and then drive away. So we installed a video camera, and to clean our alley, I had coordinated all my neighbors to get together. We spent a whole Sunday clearing the alley, making it look nice. And then on Monday morning, some guys came through, stopped right center where the camera was looking, just took out a bunch of their garbage and started throwing it on both sides of the alley. And then they would drive up the alley and unload the back of their pickup truck everywhere. So I reported this to the city, and I'm like, I've got the license plate, I've got the car, I've got these guys on camera. And the trash pickup came the next day and very nicely cleared away this garbage that they normally wouldn't. So the following day, when DC services came by, they didn't see any of the garbage, and they said, well, there's no garbage here, so there's no crime. I was like, crazy, because I have them on camera committing that crime. They're there. You can find those people. Like, we don't see a crime here, so there's nothing we're going to do further.
It's like, if they vandalize your property, don't fix it. You should have gotten out there when the waste management was coming and saying, don't take it, leave it here, leave this garbage here. The illegal dumping is a serious thing. Economists have studied it, and we have our own view of these kind of things. A former colleague of mine, Don Fullerton, very good environmental economist, has written about this. And as you try to have people be more responsible at their trash disposal, it costs more, and then people are incentivized to illegally dump it. And whether that's for materials that might have be bad for the environment, be toxic, or recycling, or whatever it is, the more responsible you're trying to be, the more difficult it is for people to follow the rules and pay for.
We're not, by the way, we're not playing a police siren sound effect in the background that you can hear.
It sounded like it's the alley next to Edgeworth.
We're not trying to be thematic.
There's a lot of stuff going on in that alley. I can tell you that much. That's a good story, though. I like that story.
Well, I think because obviously illegal dumping isn't the most serious thing, even if it's the kind of like broken windows type idea that if you allow dumping, or the reality is that the amount of effort it would take to go after these people is probably not worth the effort. And I'm kind of curious what y'all's thoughts are on the ROI for stopping these particular crimes, especially if they're more serious. Obviously, we want there to be fewer homicides. We want fewer assaults, but it's not free to have, thousands of federal officers in the city constantly trying to mitigate this specific harm.
Yeah. And first, real quick on the dumping thing, because if you dump in the right place, it might motivate like an 18-minute song by Arlo Guthrie, which everybody enjoys forever. So, dumping's not always bad.
You're skewing older on that.
If I'm being honest, I know a lot about things that happened before me. I've met Steve Bronos, for example. Yeah. I have never heard that before. So, and we've talked about Guthrie on this podcast before when we talked about Tulsa.
That's his father.
Yeah.
It's the through line for our whole. It's Data and then the Guthrie family.
Yeah.
The ROI is important because I think that's part of. Sure, less crime is a good thing. There are lots of things that we would like to see, less crime being one of them. I think the question of at what price, literally for the people to do the work, those extra forces to be in place. But then there's also maybe a cost associated with it. And we talked about this earlier, that there is like a downtick in people going out to restaurants and tourism associated with this same arrival of the National Guard from these different states and things. So, the economic impact of this is something that should be talked about and thought about, especially if you think, as Steve said earlier, that you could draw maybe if there is some conclusion that you could draw, that things that seem to work differently and better during this 30-day period that you did want to somehow try to apply, maybe you would try to increase the size of the police force in Washington, D.C. Okay, great. Well, what does that cost? And is that something that can be, that the residents of D.C. can afford? So that's a whole separate thing about whether or not you can sustain this in some way going forward.
So I have many thoughts about this, Brent. I'll try to keep it brief. I've done a couple of studies for Edgeworth that relate to some of these crime issues. One is that the U.S. government, the federal government, when evaluating safety issues, they use this concept of a statistical life, the value of a statistical life that economists use. And the most recent one in a study we did, it was $12.5 million. Every life that can be saved is worth $12.5 million. And the way economists think about it is like, if you got 3 million people together, you're like, at some point this year, we're going to be able to save if we have this intervention, we'll save the life of one of you. Not sure which of the 3 million, because once you know it's you, you're willing to pay more for it. And so if each of the 3 million people on average are willing to chip in $4 and change to save that one life, that's how you get the 12.5 million value to save one life before you know whose life is being saved. So anytime we can save lives, whether it's through traffic safety, other things, this is the value that the federal government and other researchers tend to attach to it. So we should not, anything we can get the murder rate down, that's of value to society. Other studies that we did in terms of involving prison labor, we looked at, okay, other than homicide, these other crimes, what is the average cost in terms of law enforcement, in terms of people, paying for private security and other things to protect themselves? What does this cost? And it turned out to be between $60,000 and $70,000 per crime. And what we found is that the typical person being released from prison is likely to be accused of, 4 more crimes during their criminal career, almost $250,000. Putting people in prison is a very expensive thing. It varies by state, federal prison, but it's clearly between $50,000 and $100,000 depending on the jurisdiction. So there's a huge possible ROI. And I'm not saying that a 30-day, 60-day intervention, but if we can figure out how to discourage young people, because it's usually, it's going to start out with people young, from making bad decisions that get them on a bad trajectory, it would free up a ton of resources that we spend on things. And so the question is, if we spend more now, is that going to lead to this? Or I think it's maybe if we spend it more wisely, it could lead to this. But I think there's a huge possible return on investment if we figure out the right way to deal with these problems.
Yeah, and certainly some methods of spending have a more visual component that make it look like something is being done. Whereas if you're spending your money on preventing people from committing their first crime, we don't all see that. And it's a thing that takes time to play out in the system. So we don't get the immediate benefit as well.
Right. And the kind of things that we were looking at in the prison labor study are interventions like, it's education and training and this and that. And some of them work and some of them don't. And you can try to do some more meta-analysis. But if it was easy and we knew what you could intervene and do, and it would just bring all the crime rates down and save lives, and the families of the people that are convicted and imprisoned for committing these crimes are adversely affected by this, I think we would do it. I don't think it's easy to find whatever those interventions are. I think that's the issue. And then when you try them, sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And you go like, I wonder why that happened. And it gets back to what we've been talking about throughout the whole episode. Like, because there's a lot of different factors at play here. And it's hard to do these controlled experiments and say, okay, which of these things really works?
Well, I think with all of this, the most important takeaway is that when you hear a number or even a collection of numbers, they might be telling you something that is true in the data, but the context really matters. And the implications of those numbers aren't always 100% clear, direct consequences. So be careful with your data, especially on sensitive issues like crime, and make sure you check your assumptions. Well, that's been this episode of Significance. This episode's been brought to you by Edgeworth Economics, a leader in economic consulting, and with the help of our producers, Kimberly Krewald, Ryan Deal, and Brian McLemara of Brand Ready Media, with music by Armwell Lang. Thanks for listening, StatPack, and always remember to check your assumptions.